Hi, I'm Saskia van Nouhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today I'm going to give a lecture which is a case study on the metapopulation ecology of a butterfly. And so the context for this is, several lectures ago, you had a series of lectures that was about population dynamics, considering the changes in population size over time. And then the last lecture that I gave was about changes in spatial changes in population size, or different population, or the spatial structure of populations, as opposed to the temporal structure of populations. And so this is an example of a metapopulation, which is something that I mentioned in that last lecture as a form of spatial structure of populations, especially in fragmented landscapes. Okay, so a metapopulation, this is a kind of review, is a spatially structured population that persists over time as a set of small local populations. And these local populations are so small that they can become locally extinct, but they can also be, habitat patches can be recolonized and new populations arise. So in this landscape with these small local populations, a fraction of the habitat always remains unoccupied. And there's limited dispersal among the local populations. If there was a lot of dispersal among the local populations, then we would just call it one single population, meaning we wouldn't think of them as independent populations. We would just be thinking of habitat patches where a mobile species inhabits them. A final sort of characteristic of a metapopulation is that none of the local population persists for a very long time. So the whole set persists, hopefully, for a very long time, but any one local population isn't permanent. And then finally, the dynamics, both the dynamics of the local population and hence the dynamics of the whole metapopulation, are due to things that are happening at the local population level. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a real life example of a metapopulation. And so this is the Glanville Fritillary butterfly, Melatia synxia, which is in Finland. And this is a classical example, or this is a classic model system that we think about when we think about metapopulations. And this is also a system that I've worked in for many years, and so I know it pretty well. So these are butterflies, and the butterflies are living in Northern Europe mostly, or in Europe, but mostly in Northern Europe. And they are in Finland. So here's the map, here's the globe. Finland is up here in the north, and here's the country of Finland. And then these butterflies are in the Åland Islands, which are islands that are part of Finland, but they're in the Baltic Sea between Finland and Sweden. And so this butterfly has been under survey in the Åland Islands since 1991, and it's still being surveyed annually. So this picture shows the adult butterfly, and then it shows the caterpillars. And one interesting and useful thing about these caterpillars is that they live gregariously in sibling groups. So a mother butterfly lays a cluster of eggs, those eggs hatch, and the caterpillars live together through most of their development. And so they have a silken nest, and they're kind of conspicuous because there's a lot of caterpillars there. And they spend and during the winter, this is the north, so the winters are pretty extreme, they make a big tent out of silk, and they live inside that tent, and snow can accumulate on top of the tent. And you'll see later why this aspect of their life history is important. So the butterfly feeds on two different host plant species, Plantago lanceolata and Veronica spicata. So the importance of this is not so much the species names, but that it's a limited number of species. And so we can define suitable habitat for the butterfly by the presence of these species. These species grow in grass, sort of open meadows. And the open meadows can be natural, sort of stony, open, sparse places, or they can be in an agricultural landscape. And so they're sort of naturally occurring, and some of them are maintained by agriculture. And so what unites all of these meadows is the presence of either both of these host plant species or one of them. And if we look here, what we see is a map of one area in Åland. And this sort of yellow kind of gold color is agricultural area. So you can see this is an sort of a mixed natural agricultural landscape. And then if you look closely, you can see these sort of red outlined places. There, and they have these numbers by them. Like this is 415, here's 540. And so these are all habitat patches that are suitable for the butterfly. These are places where we find the host plant and this butterfly could be there. Okay, so then have a look at that, and we'll zoom in on this a little bit in Bovik. Okay, we'll zoom on it back in a minute. Okay, so every year, about 30 students from the University of Helsinki go, and they spend a couple of weeks, or maybe 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, surveying all of the habitat patches in the autumn, looking for these nests. So these nests are kind of conspicuous, and so each of the habitat patches are visited, and the nests are counted. And so what we see, now we're zoomed in on that one place that I showed within that circle. And what we see here are, in red, the outline of a habitat patch. So this is habitat patch number 41. And in green are marked where the nests of the butterfly are in that habitat patch. And then you can see over here is a smaller habitat patch, number 42, and it has 4 nests in it. Okay, so we do that over the whole Åland Islands. Over the whole Åland Islands, there's about 4,000 suitable habitat patches for the butterfly. And what we see here is habitat patches in blue are unoccupied. So in 1 year, I think this is 2011, I'm not sure. In 1 year, the blue ones are not occupied by the butterfly, and the red ones are occupied by the butterfly. So in each year, this sort of set of the red and blue looks slightly different, right? So you can see here, so you can see there's 400 dots here. Some of them are blue, some of them are red. So at any one time, about 500 of the 4,000 habitat patches are occupied by the butterfly. And again, since these are small populations that don't last for a long time, it's not the same 500 that are occupied all the time. In fact, that's what makes it a metapopulation. So each year, there's many colonizations and many extinctions. Okay, so that's the setup. I told you about the butterfly, and I told you about the host plant, which is important for us understanding how do we define a habitat patch for the butterfly. And then I told you the data that we gather, which is this annual survey of which patches are occupied and how many nests are in those patches. Okay, and then we've been doing that from 1991 until it's still happening. And so we can say, is this really a classical metapopulation? According to these criteria which I listed before. Okay, so 1. So if it's a classical metapopulation, then the whole set, like the whole Åland Islands, persists over a very long time, but any one local population goes extinct. And so goes extinct and new ones are colonized. So in this picture, This picture is sort of illustrating that. So it's showing over time, and it's showing three different sort of sets of populations. So there's some populations that are sort of maintaining population size over a few years. This is, well, I guess over 10 years. There's populations that have declined or gone to, or become extinct over those same years, and then there's some populations that have gotten larger over those same years. So within this set of, say, 500 populations, some of them are persisting from one year to the next, some of them are going extinct, and some of them are brand new. But what we see, now here's looking at the number of larval nests between 1993 and 2001. So we see that the number of larval nests over that period of time is about constant. If we just look at one network, so sort of one cluster of patches, we see that it's not as constant, so it goes up and down. In the end, it's a little bit lower than it was at the beginning, and it's changed over the time. And you can imagine that this overall population size is made up by these networks that are either increasing or decreasing at any one time. And then in case, here's an example of one population within this network that was empty. There was a habitat patch that had no butterflies in it until 1995, and then there was butterflies, and those persisted at various different sizes over some time. So we see that overall there's kind of a consistent population size of the butterfly. In a network, it varies a little bit more, but it still on average is about the same. And in one single population, it's much more variable. It could exist or not exist at any one year. Okay. And another way to look at this is then, because the issue is imbalance between extinctions and colonizations. So this is a figure that's looking at the number of extinctions of meadows, of local populations, and the number of colonizations of local populations between 1994 and 2012. So maybe focus now on the up until 2004. So extinction is the white dots and colonization is the black dots. And so especially if we look at this part in here, we see that, like for example in 1997, the number of extinctions and colonizations was almost exactly the same. There was about, 110. Versus 1999, where there was more colonizations than extinctions, and then the next year in 2000, where there was more extinctions than colonizations, okay? And so it bounces around some, but somehow we're ending up with this relatively equal population size globally. Okay, so the second criteria for being a metapopulation is that a fraction of the suitable patches are always unoccupied. So we see that's true here in the sense that there's 4,000 habitat patches and 500 of them have butterflies in them at any one time. So the blue ones, again, don't have any butterflies in them. And so yes, only a fraction of the suitable habitat is occupied. Now, why is that a criteria for something to be a metapopulation? The reason that's a criteria is if all of the habitat patches were occupied, then there wouldn't be independence of the different populations. They would just be merged into one big population, right? One big population that is distributed over the landscape in different habitat patches. So we would call it a population that was in a heterogeneous habitat, and we wouldn't call it a metapopulation. Okay, so one could ask, so we see, okay, only 500 are occupied. Well, which 500? So the 500 that are occupied are the ones that are nearest other ones that are occupied. And that's because of the dispersal ability of the butterfly. So if a habitat patch is empty and it's very far away, say 5 kilometers from any occupied patches, no butterfly is going to get to it. It might be a completely suitable habitat patch, but no butterflies would be able to fly that far to get to it. They're not particularly dispersive. And so what we see here and this is based on the data from the Åland Islands, is the probability of colonization of a patch, which in this figure ranges from 0 to 0.25, so 25% sort of probability that it will get colonized in a year, as a function of isolation. So in patches that are very isolated have almost 0 or actually 0 probability of being colonized, whereas populations that are not isolated, meaning close to other populations of butterflies, have a relatively high probability of getting colonized. So these are empty patches near where butterflies are. Okay, so only 500 of the habitat patches are occupied, and the ones that are occupied are relatively near other ones that are occupied. And these places, say way out here, where there's blue and there's no red anywhere near it, it's going to be a long time until by chance some butterfly ends up there, if ever, even though they are actually very nice habitat patches. And so this is an aspect of metapopulation processes that makes it especially conducive to thinking about the persistence of populations in fragmented landscapes. All right, the third criteria is there's limited dispersal among local populations. So I sort of hinted at that in the last one because I said that if a habitat patch is very far away, then the butterflies can't get to it. That means the butterflies have limited dispersal at the spatial scale of this landscape. So one way to look at okay, but this criteria, the limited dispersal among populations, this isn't about colonizing a new place. This is about spreading into another butterfly population. So the way that we have addressed this by looking at the sort of movement of butterflies among existing populations is to look at the extent to which populations in different parts of the landscape are genetically different from each other. So in this picture represents by colors different genetic clusters of butterflies. And so what we see here, so for example in this dark blue cluster, butterflies that are here are relatively closely related to each other, and they're not related to the butterflies in this area. Whereas butterflies in this green area are most closely related to each other. And there's some places where the cluster is quite small, and that's probably because there's like forest or water or something kind of isolating them from movement into other places. So what we see by looking at these genetic data is the relatively long-term effects of gene flow. If there was a lot of gene flow, sort of unlimited dispersal among local populations, then these would be all the same color. There wouldn't be these different colored clusters representing limited gene flow among the populations. So there certainly are species, even species of butterflies, which are quite mobile and in this landscape would be spread all over and we wouldn't see this very colorful pattern. So what these data show us for this species is that they move there's low gene flow between populations. We also know this same kind of thing by doing mark recapture studies and seeing if we mark butterflies in one place, how frequently do we find them in another habitat patch. Okay, so the fourth criteria is that no local populations persist for a long time. Okay, so since there's all these colonizations and extinctions, yet there's only 500 populations, we know that it must be that that populations don't persist over a long time. Although it could be that maybe the same populations are always going extinct and being colonized, and there's, say, some that live for a very long time. But that's actually not the case. So there are just a few populations in the whole Åland Islands that have persisted over 10 years. And the vast majority of them live, say, 1 or 2 years. So no local population, almost no local populations persist for a long time. Okay. Oh yeah, and there have been actually no local population that we have managed to survey between now and 1991. So there's been no population that's been persisted for that whole time. Okay. Then finally, I've sort of shown that there's a lot of dynamics, meaning population sizes are growing up and going down and becoming locally extinct and recolonizing. So that's a lot of population dynamics. And the question is, what is causing that dynamics? And so one of the criteria for a classical metapopulation is that these dynamics are due to local sort of things happening locally and regionally. And so I'm going to focus on the local dynamics. So this is, and the key to this is that for a metapopulation to really be functioning as a metapopulation, the local population dynamics need to be pretty much independent of each other, meaning that the change in population size of one local population is independent, is happening for a different reason than the change in population at a different reason at any one time than a neighboring population or other populations in the Åland Islands. So it turns out that a lot of the local dynamics are due to food availability. That's sort of not surprising. So the butterflies are feeding on the host plants, and if there's, in a year, in a site, if there's a lot of host plants available, then those those caterpillars do very well and they have high survival. But in other years, they can actually run out of food and die. So in this case, there's these caterpillars. These are the early instar Melatea Synxia caterpillars, and they've eaten all of the leaves and they've moved on to trying to eat the seeds and flowers of this veronica plant, which is difficult for them to eat, and this group of caterpillars will probably starve. Okay, so in this patch, locally, there's caterpillars starving, and so in this patch, this year they're going to do very badly. But in another patch, that same year, they could have enough food around and they do very well. And so this is probably what explains their changes in population size, in addition to just sort of stochastic random processes, what explains the population size of local populations. Okay. So this picture is looking at the changes in sort of a slightly larger scale. Instead of looking at local populations, we're sort of looking at local regions, networks of populations. And this first one is looking from 1993 to 1994. And where the arrows are going down, that means the populations are getting smaller, and where they're going up, that means the populations are getting bigger. And if it's a big triangle, that means they're getting much bigger. And if it's a small triangle, that means that they're getting not much bigger. Okay, so in this year, the year 93-94, there was some populations that were increasing and some populations that were decreasing, and you can see that there actually is some spatial structure in that. These guys up here are all decreasing, and the ones in the middle are mostly increasing. And that's opposed, and then we see the next year increasing and decreasing, but it's not the same populations, right? This year, these guys up here are doing well, and these guys in here are not doing so well. And each year, you sort of see a different pattern of triangles going up and down and being big and small and green and red. And that's reflecting the metapopulation dynamics in the system. Okay. All right. So, is this a classical metapopulation? Based on the data that I've talked about so far, it is. A fraction of the pseudohill habitat patches are occupied in the landscape. That's true. There's a balance between extinctions and colonizations. In any one year, there's not necessarily exactly the same number of extinction and colonizations, but over time, there's about the same number. And importantly, the overall population size of the butterfly is pretty stable. There's limited dispersal among the populations. This allows the populations to have independent dynamics. If they moved around really a lot, they would all get big or all get small sort of together. No local populations persist for a long time. Again, if there was a bunch of big populations, then it wouldn't be a metapopulation. There would just be a persistent population at some location. Okay, then finally, we can explain a lot of the dynamics by what's happening at the local scale. Okay, so we'll call this a classical metapopulation. And this butterfly system has become sort of the iconic idea of a classical metapopulation just because it's pretty hard to find situations in which enough is known about the system that you can actually say, yeah, these things, this is what's going on. But now this is a slide I already showed you, and I sort of focused on this time, say, before 1996 when I was talking. But starting around, oh, sorry, not 1996, 2006. But starting around 2005, 2006, we actually started seeing a different pattern than we had been seeing earlier. What we started seeing is that in 1 year, there would be a sort of synchronized either almost all the populations doing really well or almost all the populations doing really poorly. So we see here in 2006, there's a lot of colonizations and few extinctions. That was a good year. But then in 2007, the next year, there was a lot of extinctions and just a few colonizations. And so we started seeing bigger fluctuations that sort of made the whole population size of the metapopulation to actually be changing a lot. And so this is beginning to not look so much like a metapopulation. So we've been investigating the change over time from when the whole system started in the early 1990s until, well, actually until now, but I'm only going to talk about data until 2016, that the metapopulation dynamics have actually been changing. And what's happening is that this sort of spatial synchrony of the performance of populations increases and decreasing. The spatial synchrony is increasing. So populations overall are tending to do good or bad versus the sort of classical idea, which is that some of them would be doing good and some would be doing bad, and so overall it would be the same every year. Okay. So this figure represents a bunch of different, each sort of line in the figure is a different network of network of populations in the Åland Islands. And this is showing that within those networks, the population sizes, this is showing the synchrony of the population sizes within those networks. And that means the spatial synchrony of the population sizes. So when it's down here, different populations in the network are not changing together. And when it's up here, different populations in the same network are changing together. And zero is when there's no correlation at all. And so what we see is that between 1994 and 2016, the synchrony in all of these networks in Åland has increased. So there's increasing spatial synchrony, which is sort of taking it out of the classical metapopulation idea. It still has metapopulation processes, but not so classical. Okay. So there are various causes, potential causes of this increased synchrony. One of them is that they're all becoming more the same because the landscape is becoming, the sort of the connectivity in the landscape is changing. So for example, maybe there's a lot more suitable habitat for the butterfly, and so none of the habitat patches are as isolated as they used to be, and so it's sort of spreading. It's spreading and it's not constrained by its dispersal ability. Or the opposite, if things were decreasing, then you could say that that the landscape connectivity is decreasing and it's causing everything to become more isolated. So that's one way, is sort of correlated changes in the landscape. Another way that causes spatial synchrony of dynamics of species is some large-scale disturbance, such as a disease. So say a disease comes and spreads and has a high rate of dispersal and spreads all over the Åland Islands and makes all of the butterflies sick at the same time. Or say there's a predator or a parasite that comes in and has that effect. Then that would cause a synchronized change. And then if that disease goes away, then they would all increase in population size at the same time. So an enemy, especially one that's responding to the density, could cause the synchrony of the dynamics spatial synchrony of the dynamics as well. And then finally, one of the ways that it can be synchronized is if the weather is spatially autocorrelated. So if the weather has the same effect on all populations and the weather is the same everywhere, then it would cause the populations to all have the same either increase or decrease. So we explored which of these things might be going on by doing field work and by looking at old data. Okay. So to cut a long story short, we don't have any evidence that there's any particular change in the landscape. The landscape isn't becoming in some way that would synchronize the populations. And we also have no large sort of influx of enemies that could be having an effect on over the whole Åland Islands. And so by looking at the statistical association of various aspects of weather with the change in abundances of the butterflies, we concluded that the increase in synchrony is probably due to increasingly synchronized weather in the Åland Islands, which means that if there's, say, a really good spring where the snow melts and the plants are growing very well, that good spring happens all over the whole Åland Islands instead of just maybe in this habitat patch and that habitat patch. And if there's a summer drought, which is kind of a common thing to happen, then the summer drought would be happening over the whole Åland Islands, not just in the north or in the south or in the east or in the west. So previously, things like amount of rain in the spring and amount of rain in the summer and temperature in the summer was quite variable over the landscape. And over the last years, that has become less and less variable. So we see here, again, this is just showing the synchrony of the butterfly populations within networks increasing over time. And it's also, and this one is showing the increase in synchrony of aspects of weather. And in this case, the important aspects of weather is the temperature in the spring, basically when does the snow melt, and the amount of rain in the summer, whether there's a summer drought or not. And these things, these two things, the spring temperature and the summer rain, affect how much food is available for the butterflies. And so that has a big effect on their abundance. Not food available for the butterflies, but food available for the caterpillars of the butterflies. Okay. So I argued that the Glanville Fritillary butterfly is a classical example of a metapopulation, and I showed you by showing you the criteria that we use to sort of call something a classical metapopulation, and then showing how it fits. And it represents a species that persists in a fragmented landscape through the balance of local extinctions and colonizations. So fragmented landscapes are landscapes in which the habitat is distributed in the landscape and its availability to the species depends on the dispersal ability of the species. And in this case, the butterfly is not able to get to all of the habitat patches that are in the landscape ever. We found, by looking over this time series, that that the sort of classical metapopulation dynamics was degrading. And instead of there being about the same number, total population size from year to year, one year the population overall would be large and the next year it would be small, and it was starting to have these big fluctuations. And now the data that I showed in this picture goes until 2015, and now actually since 2015 it's gotten much more extreme, so that we've had some extremely bad years where we thought the butterfly might be going entirely extinct, although it has persisted, and we've also had some really good years where we've had more butterflies than we have ever measured since 1991. So we've had these humongous fluctuations in the butterfly population size since 2015. Okay, So we noticed that this degradation was happening starting around 2006, although retrospectively we could see that it was actually happening before that. And now the populations are increasingly synchronized with each other, and that synchrony is due to the weather becoming more extreme and more synchronized in the landscape. Okay, and that's the end of the lecture, this case study lecture about metapopulations. Thanks.